The inspiration for the new novel is kind of hard to point to because you never, the thing with me is I'm never aware I'm actually having an inspiration, and it's later that I recognize that that was a germ for something that I'm currently writing. So that for this novel, for my second novel, came in the spring of 2003 when I was actually in Kabul just before The Kite Runner was published. I spent 2 weeks in Kabul, and while I was in Kabul I met a lot of people, and many of them women and children. I met a lot of little girls, little boys, and a lot of women. And I spoke to them. I know one of the things in Kabul is you could just walk up to people on the street and start talking to them and just kind of learn about their life, what they've been through. And I remember meeting these women and hearing their stories of what they'd gone through during the time of the Mujahideen infighting, during the Taliban years. And I was speaking to them just to learn about what had happened in my country, because I had been away for 27 years. And I remember seeing these women walking down the street with their children and thinking about, what is their life like? What are their inner thoughts? What are their inner lives? Do they have hopes? Do they have dreams? Are they disappointed? How do they feel? And when I sat down to write my second novel, I started thinking about those women. And I can't say that either of my two main characters in 1,000 Splendid Suns were based on any of those women per se, but they were based on the kind of the collective spirit of all the women that I met in Kabul in the spring of 2003. So I used those experiences to kind of create these characters, and intermittently I dipped into the stories that I had heard to create a convincing environment for these two women. The heart of the story is about their friendship. One is a poor villager who lives in a remote area of Afghanistan. The other is the smart, educated daughter of a school teacher who has high hopes for her future. And at the heart of the novel is how circumstance and fate and tragedy brings these two women together, and how their lives intersect, and how these two women grow, and how they become very, very intimate, become very close, and the relationship evolves into a mother-daughter relationship. And it's a story about friendship, story about commitment, story about self-sacrifice and family, and a longing for acceptance and belonging. And the background is the upheavals in Afghanistan, which in many ways shapes the lives of these women. And so there's a chronicling of the political upheavals in Afghanistan, beginning with the Soviet invasion, going through the Civil War, the Taliban, and all the way into the post-9/11 era. My upbringing in Kabul, I have nothing but fond memory of. I mean, I grew up, I had the good fortune of being raised in Kabul during a very peaceful era. This is before the Soviet invasion. So I have very fond memories of growing up in Kabul. Very rich life socially, had a large extended family, a lot of family friends. So we had a slew of cousins and second cousins and friends and that kind of thing. Our life revolved around being with people and interacting socially with others. And Kabul at that time was a fairly thriving cosmopolitan city with kind of this active cultural and intellectual life to which my family kind of belonged. So it was very different from the image that Kabul, the images that people think of when they think of Kabul today. And even back in those days, in the 70s, when I was 7, 8, 9 years old, I'd begun to write stories. And so reading and writing was with me from a very early age. I was raised in a very literate family. My folks could recite tons of poetry. They were raised around a lot of classic poetry. And so we always had books around the house. And I was an avid reader as a child, both the Farsi literature and poetry that I read, but also later translated novels that I read in Farsi. And I began writing at a very young age, like the little boy in my first novel. Began writing short stories, small plays that would then, quote unquote, produce for my brothers and my cousins, and we would kind of stage them for friends and family at gatherings. So it played a very central part in my life for as long as I can remember. And so I was a writer long before I decided to go into medicine later. I wrote The Kite Runner while I was working full-time, and I kept working long after The Kite Runner came out for a year and a half. So I had no intention of quitting medicine and becoming a writer. But the demands of the two careers became too heavy, and eventually I had to put one on the back burner. Well, the funny thing about the Kite Runner is that it really was kind of a slow builder. It was a word-of-mouth success, and I kept working full-time, almost full-time for a year and a half after the Kite Runner was out. And eventually it reached that tipping point, and I started spotting people reading the book in public, on airplanes and that kind of thing. There's been so much said and written about Afghanistan, precious little about the inner lives of the people there living in that environment, in those conditions. And maybe after reading this novel, people have a little bit more empathy for what happened to Afghans, particularly Afghan women, who really, really, I think, suffered the most out of everybody in Afghanistan, especially in the last 15 years.